And I'm starting the recording as well. Okay, last week we spent a lot of time on just the geography of the Palestinian land bridge and the geopolitics associated with Israel's location on that land bridge. Uh, we're going to start today with two more videos that expand on that geography a little bit further. This will key in on the major routes, and in particular, the second video will talk specifically about the relationship between Jericho and Jerusalem and the area around Jericho, which we'll be spending the rest of the day on. So I'll start with those two videos first. And the first one, share with computer sound. There. Everybody should be able to see that.
Atlas, video number 3, Major Routes in the Land of the Bible. In our last video, we learned about the 4 major geographical zones of the land of the Bible: the coastal plain, the hill country, the Rift Valley, and the Transjordan Plateau. Now we will see how each of these regions has a major route that runs through it. Knowing the major routes of the land is important, because towns and cities are often located along the routes. The Bible records hundreds of events that happen to people at real locations along these routes. Using map 116, we will mark out 4 major routes. First is the coastal highway, sometimes called the Way of the Sea, which more or less runs unimpeded along the relatively flat coastal plain. The coastal highway is a major section on the international route that joins Egypt to Mesopotamia. However, note Mount Carmel, which is a barrier to travel. Later we will see how the route traverses Mount Carmel through a pass to the Jezreel Valley, then to the Sea of Galilee and further north. The second route travels north-south on the watershed of the hill country. This route is called the Road of the Patriarchs because Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph frequently traveled on it. The third route is the Rift Valley. The flat plain provides convenient travel between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, and further beyond to the north. The fourth route runs north-south along the Transjordan Plateau. The route is called the King's Highway. Further to the north, the Bible calls the route the way to Bashan. The route continues beyond Bashan to Damascus. Let's see these same routes on map 1-2, where they appear finely highlighted in yellow already. Here is the International Coastal Highway, smooth sailing until Mount Carmel. Then the route uses a valley pass that runs through Mount Carmel and into the Jezreel Valley. Note the city of Megiddo, which functions as a sentinel guarding the pass through Mount Carmel. Megiddo, a city mentioned in both the Old and New Testaments, draws its historical significance from the layout of the regions and the routes. From the Jezreel Valley, the route continues down toward the Sea of Galilee and further north off the map. This route, in all of its sections, is known as the Great International Route that connects Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Road of the Patriarchs does not appear in yellow on map 1-2, since it is more of a local route. However, you can trace it. Remember, it follows the watershed in the hill country. From Beersheba in the south, follow it past the cities of Hebron, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Bethel, Shiloh, and Shechem. Then it descends into the Jezreel Valley, where it joins the international route. The Rift Valley route connects the Dead Sea to the Sea of Galilee. We've marked it out on the east side of the Rift Valley along the foot of Gilead. Finally, the King's Highway comes through Moab, along the plateau, past Rabat Ammon and Gilead, north through Bashan, and off the map toward Damascus. Using map 115, let's take a closer look at why the Jezreel Valley is a hub for routes. Note that this map is east-oriented. North is to the left. The Jezreel Valley is a wide, flat, triangular, or arrowhead-shaped plain that breaks the hill country. It is a hub of routes, since it is the easiest place to cross east-west through the land of the Bible. We've already seen how the Great International Route comes along the coastal plain and then utilizes the Jezreel Valley, avoiding the high hill country as it makes its way northeast. Note likewise how traffic crossing east-west joining both the Rift Valley route and the King's Highway with the Mediterranean Sea, also avoids high hill country by passing through the Jezreel Valley. As the most convenient east-west crossing in the land of the Bible, the Jezreel Valley is an intersection of international routes. There are many biblical events that occurred in the Jezreel Valley because it is the #1 way to cross east-west through the country. Here is the wide Jezreel Valley, looking from Mount Carmel as far as Gilead in Transjordan, and the ruins of ancient Megiddo overlooking the Jezreel Valley. Across the valley are the Nazareth Ridge, Mount Tabor, and the Hill of Moreh.
Just going to pause here a second. Take note of Mount Tabor and the Hill of Moreh, because we'll be spending time talking about those next week.
As in biblical times, the modern highway comes through the Megiddo Pass into the Jezreel Valley. There are other east-west passages through the hill country, but none are as convenient as the Jezreel Valley. Note on this cross-section sketch how difficult it is to travel from the Mediterranean Sea to Transjordan through the hill country near Jerusalem. Leaving the coastal plain, one ascends nearly 3,000 feet to the hill country watershed, and then descends over 4,000 feet into the Rift Valley. The ascent to Transjordan is another 4,000-foot climb. In comparison, traveling west to east via the Jezreel Valley involves a relatively flat journey and ascent of a little over 200 feet.
Hey, I'm standing here on a ridge in the city of Nazareth, and behind me is the Jezreel Valley. To my right, you can see Mount Tabor, where Deborah and Barak gathered 10,000 Israelites to go to battle against the Canaanites. And then to my left, you can see Mount Moreh, where on the slope is the city of Nain. And just after Jesus announced that he had the authority to raise the dead, he raised a widow's son from the dead in that city.
Okay, we'll stop sharing that one and go to the second video. Which is there. There we go.
This video is commentary for the Satellite Bible Atlas, maps 1.8 and 1.9, approaches to Jerusalem and the Benjamin region. We will focus on a cross-section of territory that stretches over 4 regions. The Shephelah foothills to the west of Jerusalem, the hill country where Jerusalem sits, 2,500 to 2,800 feet above sea level. Then to the east, the rugged Judean wilderness, sloping down to the Rift Valley and Jericho. Jerusalem's latitude is about the same as the top of the Dead Sea. So, to find Jerusalem quickly on any map, from the top of the Dead Sea, come directly west or left. Remember, however, that Jerusalem is over 4,000 feet higher in elevation than the Dead Sea. Note that the area north of Jerusalem was allotted to the tribe of Benjamin. Jerusalem itself sits within the borders of Benjamin. We will see that the most important routes to Jerusalem, even from the east or west, approach Jerusalem from the north, that is, through the territory of Benjamin. On map 1.9, take a closer look at the important area just north of Jerusalem. The area is called the Central Benjamin Plateau. It is relatively flat ground on the hill country watershed, with canyons cutting to its east and west. Only 3 to 7 miles north of Jerusalem, the Central Benjamin Plateau is outlined by the biblical cities of Gibeon on the west, Mitzpah on the north, Geba on the east, and Gibeah, the capital of Saul, on the south. Ramah, the hometown of Samuel, is at the center of the plateau. The Central Benjamin Plateau is staging ground for main routes heading to Jerusalem. Control of Central Benjamin means access to Jerusalem. A historical example of this can be seen on map 6-2. During the divided monarchy of Israel's history, Baasha, king of Israel in the north, came down and captured Ramah in central Benjamin, as 1 Kings 15:16 says, that he might prevent anyone from going out or coming in to Asa, king of Judah.
I'll pause here again. If you remember the document I sent out called Kings, we all are very familiar with the early kings of Israel, like Saul and Samuel, Solomon and David. But once the united monarchy split into north and south, you have a whole series of kings of Israel and a whole series of kings of Judah. Well, Baasha happens to be one of those kings of Israel, and Asa happens to be one of the kings of Judah at this particular moment in history. So they're probably not names you're familiar with, but you can find them on the King's document and see how they are chronologically in relation to all the other kings of Israel and kings of Judah.
Diplomatic maneuvering and war by proxy, Asa removed this threat to his capital in Jerusalem and established a border between Judah in the south and Israel in the north by building up the towns of Mitzpah and Geba. Even east-west routes crossing through the hill country are naturally funneled through Benjamin. The region of Benjamin is lower in elevation than the hill country north and south of it. If one looks at the hill country from the west, Benjamin sits in a kind of saddle. Jerusalem and Benjamin are 800 feet lower than the hills near Bethel to the north or Hebron to the south. So east-west routes tend to run through Benjamin. Let's look at the western approach to Jerusalem on map 1-8. The western approach comes from the coastal plain through the Ajalon Valley in the Shephelah foothills. In the Old Testament period, the city of Gezer supervised this area. Gezer today is a large ruin, or tell, that was fortified by the Canaanites, Philistines, and Israelites. As the front door to the capital of Israel, King Solomon fortified Gezer. Solomonic period ruins have been excavated here at Tel Gezer.
We're at ancient Gezer on a Solomonic gate.
From Gezer, the route continues east through the Ajalon Valley to Emmaus, the New Testament period counterpart to Gezer. From Emmaus, the route angles a bit north to the Beth Horon Ridge route. By staying on the Beth Horon Ridge, the route avoids the deep canyons that drain the hill country. The route joins the central Benjamin Plateau at Gibeon. It connects with the Road of the Patriarchs, or Central Ridge route, at Ramah, where it turns south past Gibeah to Jerusalem. The Beth Horon Ridge route is perhaps the most important connection from the coast to the central hill country near Jerusalem. Therefore, there were multiple biblical events that occurred here.
Hi, we are on the Beth Horon Ridge route. During Joshua's time, he pursued the Amorites along with the Israelites down this route, and while the Amorites were fleeing, large hailstones fell on them from heaven.
Here is an aerial view of the Beth Horon Ridge route. The route comes out from the Ajalon Valley, up on the ridge past Lower and Upper Beth Horon. Solomon fortified towns along this route to guard the approach to his capital, Jerusalem. There is another route that ascends from the Ajalon Valley into the hill country. From Emmaus, this route ascends on a ridge to the town of Kiryat Jearim. Then it angles north and also joins the central Benjamin Plateau at the site of Gibeon. On map 1-8, review the two routes that approach Jerusalem from the west. The first route travels through the flat Ajalon Valley plain and then ascends into the hill country on the Beth Horon Ridge. It comes into the central Benjamin Plateau at Gibeon and joins the hill country watershed at Ramah. From Ramah, the route turns south on the Road of the Patriarchs, passing Gibeah to Jerusalem. The second route also comes through the Ajalon Valley, but ascends a ridge to Kiryat Jearim. Note how Kiryat Jearim is separated from Jerusalem by two deep canyons, the Upper Sorek and Kesalon valleys. These canyons function as a moat on Jerusalem's western flank, forbidding any easy access to Jerusalem from the west. Instead, the Kiryat Jearim route angles north to Gibeon and Ramah in central Benjamin. There is a route that connects Kiryat Jearim more directly to Jerusalem, but it is not an easy one. It goes treacherously up and down valleys and ridges. Map 5.1 shows a historical event connected to the Kiryat Jearim ridge route. In the days of Samuel, the Ark of the Covenant returned from Philistia to Bet Shemesh, and then up to Kiryat Jearim, where the Ark stayed for 20 years until Samuel led Israel in a national repentance. The Ark stayed some 100 years in Kiryat Jearim, until King David brought it into Jerusalem. We can speculate on the route David used. He may have come through central Benjamin, past the cities of Ramah and Gibeah, Saul's capital, or the Ark traveled the more difficult road across the deep valleys flanking Jerusalem's western side. Map 6.1 shows the Beth Horon and Kiryat Jearim ridges being used. Solomon's son Rehoboam had built forts in Judah, but when he forsook the law of the Lord, his forts meant nothing. The Lord brought Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt against him.
So again, here are two more kings. At this moment in history, the king of Israel was Jeroboam, and the king of Judah was Rehoboam. The cities that are underlined in red were the cities that were captured by Pharaoh Shishak's army during this period.
Shishak's own records parallel the biblical account. Shishak recorded the conquest of towns along both the Beth Horon and Kiryat Jearim ridges as he made his way up to threaten Rehoboam in Jerusalem. Now let's examine the eastern approaches to the hill country and Jerusalem. This photo shows the remnants of a Roman road between Jericho and Jerusalem. On map 1.9, all traffic that comes from the east across the Jordan River is absorbed by Jericho. Jericho is in the Rift Valley, 800 feet below sea level. The most direct route from Jericho to Jerusalem climbs the ascent of Adumim, staying south of the Wadi Kilt. Wadi is an Arabic word, often abbreviated W on our maps, and Nahal, abbreviated N, is Hebrew, meaning canyon. Wadis are often dry and deep, but have water flowing in them during the winter rains.
We're in the Judean desert on the way from Jericho to Jerusalem, and it's characterized by deep canyons like the one behind me.
The rugged terrain of the Judean desert is drained by deep-cutting wadis, like the Wadi Kilt visible here. Routes traversing the desert avoid the deep wadis and stay on ridges. Here is the path of the ascent of Adumim along the ridge above Wadi Kilt. Only 15 miles away, Jerusalem is 3,500 feet higher in elevation than Jericho. The Good Samaritan would have descended along the Adumim route when he assisted a man that had fallen among thieves. Jesus traveled on this ridge when he came to Jerusalem to die. The next route that ascends into the hill country from Jericho is called the Ephraim Ridge Route. This route follows a ridge between the drainage of the Wadi Nuema and the Wadi Ujah. A route ascending directly west from Jericho is called the Zeboim route. Note that near the town of Michmash, this route forks. One fork angles north toward Ai and joins the road of the patriarchs near Beth Aven and Bethel. Joshua undoubtedly utilized this route when he conquered and burned Ai. Another fork turns toward the town of Michmash, and a place the Bible calls the Pass. The Pass is a place where one can cross over from one side to the other of the Wadi Suanit. The town of Michmash guards the north side of the pass. Geba guards the south side. From Geba, one has access to central Benjamin.
We are down in the Suanit Valley, where we were just overlooking between Michmash and Geba. And this is a place where Jonathan crossed with his armor bearer from Geba down here between these two cliffs, which he had to climb using his hands, up to the Philistine garrison at Michmash. And the cliffs have been named in the Bible in 1 Samuel 14:4, where it says, "On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff, one called Bozez and the other Sinai. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, and the other to the south toward Geba."
Map 7.7 illustrates a historical event at the Pass of Michmash in the days of King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. A garrison of Assyrian soldiers threatened Jerusalem from the north. Isaiah tells us the enemy came from the north and deposited supplies on the north side of the pass at Michmash. Then Isaiah says, "They've crossed over the pass. He's lodging at Geba. Ramah is terrified. Gibeah of Saul has fled." The Assyrians came to Nob and shook their fist threateningly at Jerusalem. But that was enough. The Lord cut the Assyrians down like a tree.
We're just on our way to Jerusalem and taking a little break right now. I think we're about to go on see some parts of the Roman road and Mount of Olives. More or less, man, Jesus did some work to come to die.
There we go. Now we're back. The credit for gaining the foothold in the Judean heartland up on the main watershed road west of the Jordan goes to Joshua. His exploits fit into the following design. Phase 1 was the establishment of a bridgehead west of the Jordan, and then Phase 2 was the gaining of a foothold in the mountains. Phase 3 was the spreading out from the secured base of the central mountain massif to widen the area of occupation and settlement. Let me share with you this map. Here we go. Phase 1 was divided into 2 stages, the river crossing and the securing of the bridgehead. And the place chosen by Joshua for crossing the Jordan was the sector of the river that was closest to the Dead Sea here. His choice was influenced by a number of factors. First, the approaches to the Jordan River from Transjordan would be through parts of Moab that were already occupied by the Israelites. So in the event that Joshua had to make a hasty retreat, he'd be retreating back into friendly territory. Second, the river could be forded in many places all along this sector, which gave the crossing parties a choice of different routes according to any potential hostile interference. Now, when I'm speaking about a fording place is a place where you can cross a river without boats and without bridges. In other words, you can walk across it and you can herd cattle across it. So it's not likely to be more than waist deep, not very wide, and the water is not moving very fast. So there were a number of locations in this area that fit that pattern. And they were traditional fording places for the ancient people who lived and worked around that area. The next consideration was once you got across the river, as we just saw in the second video, there are a number of different tracks that lead up into the Judean highlands that branch out from Jericho. Again, more options. So as far as a prospective bridgehead was concerned, there was really only one real option, and that was from the lower Jordan, were the plains of Jericho. And in the middle of the plains of Jericho was the oasis city of Jericho, which is possibly the oldest city on earth. And it's certainly the oldest walled town known to us so far. So I'm sure there were towns and villages and outposts and refuges that are probably older. But in terms of what you could call an organized city, Jericho is probably the oldest city on earth. We're dealing with an area, the time frame now of, let me see, 1406, as you can see there. That's where we are chronologically, 1406 BC. Jericho was here some 5,000 years before Joshua, if you can imagine that. Because of the oasis and the spring there, this became a very fertile area. So there was an abundance of vegetables and fruits and water sources. And so caravans that were traveling and commuting between the banks of the Jordan, as well as those that were traveling north and south along the river, they would use this as a primary water source. So the capture of the oasis meant you would gain a fertile base full of fruit and water, as well as you would control the water source, which was vital to all the movement in this area. So the big problem for the Israelites was that they had no experience in siegecraft. And of course, the capture of the town that was secured behind the walls and towers and battlements was going to be a problem. Now, when I say siegecraft, I'm referring to those weapons or implements of war that were used to breach walled cities, like rams and catapults and large towers with ramps that they could use to breach walls. So that's siegecraft. And the ancient Israelites at this point in their history had no experience. I mean, they just came out of wandering in the desert for 40 years, with whatever they could carry on their backs, basically. So that was going to be a problem. So Joshua commanded his scouts to reconnoiter the other side of the Jordan River for the best possible bridgehead, and he said to pay special attention to Jericho. And the exploits of these spies is pretty much well known. So let's see, Jim, you have the first verse, Joshua chapter 2 verse 1. And don't forget to unmute yourself.
I do. And here it says, Joshua, son of Nun, sent out 2 spies secretly to Shechem, and he said, go out and explore the country at Jericho. They went and entered the house of a harlot called Rahab, where they lodged. Word of this was brought to the king of Jericho. Take notice, some men from the Israelites have come here tonight to reconnoiter the country. Then the king of Jericho sent a message to Rahab. Send out the men who came to you lodging in your house, for they've come to reconnoiter the whole country.
Okay, thanks. So the king of Jericho was one of these Canaanite petty kings, okay? And he had gotten word that these spies had come to this particular location where the harlot was located. Now, in some Bible translations, they don't use the word harlot. They use the word prostitute. But if you go back to the original Hebrew, the Hebrew word for harlot was zana. And the verb from which it's arrived, zan, means to feed and to provide victuals. So actually, Rahab, in this sense, sounds more like a hostess who kept an inn for wayfarers. So it was a well-known place. And the king of Jericho didn't have any trouble telling her, look, you need to get these people out of there because they've come here to spy on us. Of course, she didn't do that. She was sort of leaning on the side of the Israelites, and she hid them on the roof. Careless talk of at inns have always been an excellent source of information. The guests, get something to drink, and the hostess that has sharp ears, and that combined becomes a coveted intelligence objective. Frederick the Great, in fact, advised his heirs to have an innkeeper in their pay in every region. So one of the subjects that was learned from listening to conversations sitting around this inn is the true morale and the opinion of the population. So Dennis and Pat, if you've got Joshua chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. when you're unmuted.
Okay, verses 10 and 11. We have heard how the Lord dried up the Red Sea in front of you when you were leaving Egypt. We have also heard how you killed Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings east of the Jordan. We were afraid as soon as we heard about it. We have all lost our courage because of you. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and here on earth. That's it.
Okay? Thanks. So this was a particular problem. Rahab was telling these spies what the current feeling was among the population, because they've been hearing what's been going on with the Israelites, conquering Sihon and the Amorites over on Transjordan in the plains of Moab, and we talked about that a little bit last week, and now possibly threatening Jericho. So the actual conquest was looked at it like in two waves. The spearhead was to be the armed warriors of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, which had already settled in Transjordan. And they were to be followed by the bulk of the people, who would arrive with their families and all their possessions immediately to settle every parcel of conquered land. By means of this arrangement, if the occupying clans were faced with a Canaanite attempt at reconquest, the occupying Israelites would be spurred on by a desire to defend their new homes. So before beginning the campaign, Joshua was vested with supreme power, including the meting out of capital punishment. So, Art, if you got to Joshua chapter 1, verse 18.
Got it right here. Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey your words, whatever you may command them, will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous.
Okay, thank you. So while Moses had been the prototype of the divinely inspired leader, one of those few people in history who, by their awe-inspiring charisma, laid down the laws and they were followed, Joshua, on the other hand, was the first leader that was actually elected by the General Assembly of Israel. So the actual crossing of the Jordan River was facilitated by an earthquake. Susan, have you got Joshua chapter 3, verses 14 through 17?
Yes. And it came to pass, when the people removed from their tents to pass over Jordan, that the waters of Jordan shall be cut off from the waters that come down from above, and they shall stand upon a heap. And it came to pass, when the people removed from their tents to pass over Jordan, and the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as they that bear the ark were come unto Jordan, and the feet of the priests that bear the ark were dipped in the brim of the water, for Jordan overfloweth all his banks all the time of harvest, that the waters which came down from above stood and rose up upon a heap very far from the city Adam, that is, beside Zaratan. And those that came down toward the sea of the plain, even the salt sea, failed and were cut off, and the people passed over right against Jericho. And the priests that bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of Jordan, and all the Israelites passed over on dry ground until all the people were passed clean over Jordan.
Okay, thank you. What a bit of luck. As I said earlier, Joshua had every intent of crossing the Jordan. He was looking for likely places to ford the river. So whether the water stopped flowing or not, he was going to cross this river. So, but it turns out that there was a bit of luck here, or divine providence, whichever. All of a sudden, he was able to cross on dry land. And if you look up here on the map to the north, here are the two cities that Susan just mentioned, Zarethan and Adam, located. Now, right here where this arrow is pointing, you can see where the road crosses the river. That's the current location of the town there now is no longer called Adam, but it's called Damaya. And this is the Tel Damaya Bridge, present day Tel Damaya Bridge. Now, it's been reported several times, and this is the place where the course of the river is repeatedly blocked when a perpendicular bank of soft soil along the banks caves in because of earth tremors. In 1267 AD, when the lower river temporarily dried up, as a consequence of a similar blockage, the Mameluke Sultan, Baybars, was able to exploit 16 hours to lay foundations for the predecessor of the present Tel Damaya Bridge. Because it was dry, he was able to put in the foundations for his bridge. He had 16 hours to do it. And that served him as a main artery during his subsequent campaigns to recapture the Holy Land from the Crusaders. A more recent instance of this phenomena was reported by Professor John Garstang, who related that in 1927, a section of the cliff at Tel Damaya that rose up 150 feet fell completely across the river, completely dammed it up so that no water flowed down the Jordan for 21 and a half hours. So it's happened on many occasions. And because all of a sudden the river dried up at the moment that Joshua was ready to cross, he was convinced of God's assistance. And the Israelite host crossed over and completely surrounded Jericho. So now we're back up to Jim. Joshua chapter 6. Verses 2 through 5.
All right. Then Yahweh said to Joshua, "Now I am delivering Jericho and its king to your hands. All your fighters, valiant warriors, will march around the town and make a circuit once. And for 6 days you will do the same thing. But 7 priests will carry 7 trumpets in front of the ark. On the 7th day, you will go 7 times around the town, and the priests will blow their trumpets. When the ram's horn ring out, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, the whole people must utter a mighty war cry, and the town wall will collapse then and there. Then the people can storm the town, each man going straight ahead."
Okay, thanks. Scholars have searched far and wide for what the academics would consider a rational interpretation of the conquest of Jericho, and there's been all kinds of bizarre explanations that have been offered, but more realistically, the archaeological evidence has proven that the walls of Jericho during Joshua's time must have been in a rather negligent state of repair. Remember now, this town was 5,000 years old when he showed up. Yet even granting the existence of cracks in the walls, possibly from the same earthquake that dammed up the river, it's just not enough to explain how it really happened. So, and unfortunately, the late Bronze period Canaanite Jericho had largely been washed away before the town was reconstructed by Hiel, the Bethelite, during King Ahab's time, which was in 871 BC. So nearly, 600 years after Joshua is when they rebuilt the town. So the solution to the problem seems to come not from any material evidence, but from a comparison with ancient military devices and strategies. In a collection of strategies that was published by Sextus Julius Frontinus before the end of the 1st century AD, I'll read it to you. Quote, When Gnaeus Pompey on one occasion was prevented from crossing a river because the enemy's troops were stationed on the opposite bank, he adopted the device of repeatedly leading his troops out of camp and back again, and then out of camp, and then back again, and then out of camp, and then back again. And then when the enemy were at last tricked into relaxing their watch on the roads, he made a sudden dash across the river. So this sounds similar. For 6 days, the entire Israelite host solemnly, quietly filed around the walls of Jericho in full array. And for 6 days, the people of Jericho sprang to their weapons and manned the ramparts and the battlements. At first, they were very uneasy. They were afraid of these marching columns, and to them, the possible magic involved, because ahead of the column were the priests carrying the ark. Now, to the ancient Israelites, there was no magic here. They understood the value of that ark as being the direct hand of God handing them the laws. So to them it wasn't magic. But to the Canaanites, who didn't believe in the one God, to them it was like sorcery. It was magic, which is to the advantage of Joshua, actually. But after the first terror and the anxiety had subsided, the people of Jericho grew accustomed to the strange performance, and they relaxed. And precisely at the moment, on the 7th day after the Israelites had begun their now customary maneuver, at a sign from the leader, the silent, very calm, very tranquil procession suddenly changed into a column of frenzied assault. And before the dazed, terror-stricken defenders could collect themselves, the Israelites had scaled the walls, passed through cracks on any portion that was damaged by the tremors that was only hastily patched, and, quote, utterly destroyed all that was in the city by the edge of the sword. This strategy of lulling the enemy into a false sense of security by gradually accustoming him to the maneuvers that will later be used in an opening to develop an attack has served planners extremely well over the years. The British misled the Turkish and the German foes at Romani and Sinai using this technique in 1916. More recently, the Syrians and the Egyptians deceived the Israelis right before the October 1973 war, when they repeatedly mobilized their assault forces right up on Israel's border, and even bringing bridging equipment and combat formations, and then they pull back. I don't know if you remember that history. I remember it because I'd just been commissioned a lieutenant, so I knew about the October 93 war. And this was the same thing that the Syrians and Egyptians did to Israel. They would march out to the border, ready to have a battle, and then pull back. And they kept doing it over and over again. Finally, the Israelis said, this is nothing. And then, boom, it hit the fan. So the capture of Jericho gave the Israelites their first real foothold west of the Jordan. Joshua's next goal was penetration into the Judean mountains. Let me bring that map back up again. So now we have a foothold in Jericho. Now we need to move up into the Judean mountains. The Judean mountains are a natural fortress for lightly armed Israelites, so that they could withstand the onslaught of heavily armed Canaanite forces. Joshua had no doubt that if he was to get involved into a pitched battle on the open plain, where his tribal host was practically defenseless against the Canaanite chariots, on the other hand, topographical conditions alone precluded the deployment of heavily armed regulars and chariot formations in the mountains, and it gave the lightly armed troops a chance to make up for their deficiencies by using combination of stealth and cunning and daring and mobility. And furthermore, the mountains were only sparsely settled and therefore permitted the Israelite entrenchment and colonization, whereas there was little chance at all of subduing the densely populated and strongly fortified cities that were out in the plains. So the preliminary step in the campaign to penetrate the mountains was brilliant. he made an alliance with the Gibeonites. And if you look on the map off to the west, far edge, here's the main town of Gibeon. This is where the Gibeonites were located. And the Gibeonites themselves were kind of a rather hard-pressed, small tribal confederation that had settled there, probably not very long before Joshua showed up on the scene. So he made an alliance with them. And the chief town is only 5 miles northwest of Jerusalem, here. So having thus secured the rear of his chosen theater of operation, Joshua began to gather the necessary intelligence about his objective, which was Ai, here, or more probably the terrain around Bethel, up here, the town that commanded the ascent to the Judean watershed from a number of different tracks. The reports that were brought back by his scouts must have caused Joshua to change his mind about attacking Bethel because of its strong defenses. Such an attack would really not necessary because it was Ai, located here, that really commanded the ascent to the watershed. So Ai had been a heavily fortified town 1,300 years before Joshua. But the archaeological evidence shows that it only recently been resettled. The biblical narrative, when you read it, leads us to the assumption that to prevent a threat of the Israelites to make an attempt on their town, which must have seemed imminent after the fall of Jericho, the people in Bethel decided, hey, we better go down and fortify Ai because of this Israeli threat. So it had only recently been refortified, probably hastily. So the scouts' evaluation of Bethel wasn't very good, but the intelligence reports that they brought back about Ai were pretty optimistic, because the scouts, unfortunately, were not familiar with the great strength that's inherent in ruins that have been prepared as defensive positions. So he advised Joshua that don't worry about it. A token force up to 3,000 men, it's all you need to capture the town of Ai. And Joshua committed an error common to many generals, made overconfident by repeated success, and he adopted the scouts' suggestions. And the results were predictable. Let's see, who's next? Is it Dennis? I don't remember.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Okay, Joshua chapter 7, verses 3 and 4.
Okay. And they returned to Joshua and said to him, do not let all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. Do not weary all the people there, for the people of Al are few. So about 3,000 men went up there from the people, but they fled before the men of Al. Is that Ai or
Ai?
Ai, excuse me.
Ai.
Yeah.
So the 3,000 troops went up to attack Ai, and they were immediately repulsed, and the Israelites fled in retreat. This tactical drawback, it was severe, but it wasn't a calamity. Far more dangerous was the psychological impact that this defeat had. Not only did the Israelites start to lose faith in their prowess, but the myth of Israel's invincibility was about to be broken and spread across the countryside. So, Art, have you got Joshua chapter 7, verse 9?
The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name?
Okay, so Joshua's reaction to all of this was to renew the attack almost immediately, making the natural self-assurance of the victors of Ai the basis for a trick which would assure success, according to the plan of, number one, employment of not a token force, but the complete tribal host. Number two, to dislodge the garrison at Ai from its stronghold by a simulated retreat of the main force of Israelite troops after making a head-on assault similar to the first attempt. Number 3, he had a small detachment of hand-picked troops that located themselves up here in the rear of Ai, and they moved there under cover of night, so that and their job was to capture the objective of Ai that would be deserted by the defenders, who were now chasing the Israelis who were, quote, running away in a fake retreat. Number 4, the enemy would be trapped by the pursuing enemy between the main force and the capturers of Ai. And number 5, he also sent a small detachment to put a strong blocking force in between the towns of Bethel and Ai, in case the people of Bethel tried to reinforce Ai once it came under attack from the rear. So a commander's place during battle must be where the most critical decisions are being taken. And Joshua judged that the most difficult task lay with the main body in faking a retreat. First, it would be necessary to return to a concerted attack immediately upon receiving the order. Secondly, it was imperative to choose exactly the right moment to wheel his force around, and consequently, Joshua decided to take personal command over the main body. And after dispatching the troops that were selected to lie in ambush in the rear of Ai, he moved into camp with his troops on the eve of battle, and Joshua's camp is depicted here in this little square. This is where Joshua's camp was. So the main force attacked, and that's what this is. The main force attacks this blue line. And when as anticipated, Joshua staged a retreat, and the defenders gave chase. So who's got the next reading? There you go, Susan. Chapter 8, verse 16.
And all the people that were in Ai were called together to pursue after them. And they pursued after Joshua and were drawn away from the city.
Okay, so when the defenders were well drawn off and deep in the steep gorge of the Wadi Muhassin, Joshua quickly mounted an adjacent slope. He flashed his sword, which was a prearranged signal, and whereupon the assault force then rushed the practically abandoned positions up in Ai. The assault force, I'm talking about the hand-picked troops. The defenses in Ai were practically abandoned, and they set them all on fire. And at the same time, Joshua turned his troops 180 degrees, as shown here, and attacked. So before the pursuers could recover, they were attacked simultaneously from the rear by the hand-picked troops who had captured Ai, and by the Israeli host to their front. And then it's not specifically stated in the Bible anywhere, but the blocking force up here probably also joined in the melee. And the enemy was completely trapped. And then for generations after that, it was said that not a single soul escaped the ensuing rout. Now the fall of Ai rang a warning bell among all the Canaanite rulers of Cisjordan. The most immediately concerned were all the little petty kings who ruled the Judean highlands. The alliance that Joshua had made with the Gibeonites was a disaster for the Canaanite cause. Jim, Joshua chapter 10, verses 3 and 4.
Okay. 10. Oh, I got to pronounce this name, huh? Adonizedek. I got some good ones here. It's as bad as reading in church. The king of Jerusalem sent word to Hoham, the king of Hebron, Piram, the king of Jarmuth, Jephthah, the king of Lachish, and Debnar, the king of Eglon. Join me and help me to conquer Gibeon, because it has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites.
Okay, so the moment of truth of this newly formed alliance has finally come, perhaps earlier than they thought. But when the Gibeonites called for help, when it arrived at the Israeli camp at Gilgal, fortunately, Joshua did not waver. Let me share this map. Get rid of that one. Here is the Israeli camp at Gilgal, which is just outside of Jericho. And here's the town of Gibeon. Now, all those little kings that you pronounced, keep in mind that throughout this whole territory, all these little towns, each one was ruled by their own little king. There was a king of Eglon. There was a king of Lachish. There was a king of Makkedah. There was a king of Hebron. These were all Canaanite petty kings. Okay? There wasn't any, centralized government back at that time. So Joshua quickly prepared for battle. And at nightfall, in order to neutralize the possible enemy observers, he started out on a march of about 15 miles. And the Israelites reached the area just around here, outside of Gibeon, without having been observed. It's very hilly, it's wooded, it's sparsely populated, so they were able to get there unnoticed. Meanwhile, Joshua now was able to reconnoiter his objective for the first time from one of the adjacent hillsides. The Amorite allies, all of those petty kings, the Amorite allies had Gibeon completely surrounded. They were going to punish the king of Gibeon, who made peace with Joshua. And as the Amorites had no inkling of the presence of the enemy at their rear, and they had neglected to send out an effective screening parties to warn off any unexpected hostile movement in that area, Joshua was able to achieve complete surprise. The downward gradient of his assault from the hills gave his troops additional impetus and penetrating force, and the Amorites broke and fled in utter confusion. The route of their flight was along the Beth Horon Pass. Remember from the first video that we talked about, that we showed you. The Beth Horon Pass is where they fled, which is a major gateway to Judah, which figures throughout the country's history, both in war and peace. Now you have to think about the physical prowess of the Israelite troops that has to be admired. After an approach march of 15 miles over a steep ascent of more than 1,900 feet, which took almost all night, they went immediately into battle. And the length of the battle, it's hard for us to judge, but after routing the enemy, the Israelites were still able to exploit their victory by a pursuit. So, who's next? Jim? I lost track.
And Dennis.
Or Dennis. Okay. Joshua 10, 12 through 14.
Okay. On the day that the Lord gave the men of Israel victory over the Amorites, Joshua spoke to the Lord. In the presence of the Israelites, he said, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon. Moon, stop over Ajalon Valley." The sun stood still, and the moon did not move until the nation had conquered its enemies. This is written in the book of Jashar. The sun stood still in the middle of the sky and did not go down for a whole day. Never before and never since has there been a day like it when the Lord obeyed a human being. The Lord fought on Israel's side.
Okay, thanks. And from the videos that we've seen, you're starting to put together geographically where all these things are. So now when you read the Ajalon Valley, you know, I mean, here it is right here. You could probably spot it on a map as well as anyone now. So Joshua, sensing in the midst of the pursuit that if he didn't crush the Amorite armed forces completely, much of the decisiveness of his victory was going to be lost. There are lots of victories have been robbed of its fruits by the victors' obvious inability to exploit their own success. Wellington was without a means to prevent the orderly retreat and regrouping of the French after the Battle of Talavera in 1805. Napoleon didn't follow up his victory at Ligny in 1815 by destroying Blucher's Prussian forces, thus giving the old Prussian marshal a chance to reinforce the Allies 2 days later at Waterloo, thereby giving Napoleon his defeat. Today, modern military doctrine stresses planning for the exploitation of a victory, which has become an integral phase in any operation, including allocating troops and material and the means for this purpose as early as the planning stages of any battle. So in Joshua's case, the problem was to achieve maximum success while the moon was still visible in the west, which is the direction of the Ajalon Valley here, and while the sun was just coming up in the east towards Gibeon. In other words, he wanted to crush his foe before the dawn gave way to full daylight and the enemy had escaped the steep valleys of the Beth Horon Pass. So the last phase of the contest brought the Israelites, if you follow this sort of a pinkish line, brought them all the way down through the Ajalon to the gates of the city of Azekah, which is a Canaanite stronghold. It later became one of the main fortresses of Judah. Altogether, the Israelite warriors had traversed about 30 miles in 45 to 48 hours, 2/3 of it under battle conditions. That's amazing. So as the initial stretch of the Amorite fight was past Gibeonite territory, the Gibeonite farmers undoubtedly turned out in force to harass the fugitives. The Bible talks about great stones from heaven that were cast down upon the escaping Canaanites. And it's hard to avoid the analogy with the retreat of the Austrians and later the Burgundians in their wars against the Swiss, and the French in their battles to put down the Tyrolean resistance in 1809. To cite just a few examples, when the population rolled out in large numbers and they on the hillsides, and they rolled stones and boulders down into the valleys, killing some and maiming others and blocking many from making their retreat. And all these harassing actions go a long way towards explaining the length of this long-running battle. So after Joshua had repelled the Canaanite counteroffensive in Judah, the Israelite tribes began to take possession of the sparsely settled mountain massif. From central Judah, Joshua fanned out in every direction, and according to the biblical accounts, we have to credit him with both the complete conquest of the central mountain massif and of the western foothills, and of the conquest of Galilee. And this will be our last map. Let me share this one. Following the Bible's account, we learn that Joshua smashed the alliance of all the northern Canaanites headed by Jabin, who was King Hatzor, Jabin was the main general of King Hatzor. Oh, here's Hatzor right here. H-A-Z-O-R is pronounced Hatzor. Let's see. Next we have Art. Joshua 11, 5 through 9.
All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them over to Israel, slain. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them, and the Lord gave them unto the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, and to Misrephoth, Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah, and to the east, until no survivors were left. Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots.
Okay. This account is actually the first to mention the war chariot, which was the forerunner of the modern armored fighting vehicle and was one of the main armaments from the time of its introduction by the Hittites and the Hyksos. Remember, we talked about the Hyksos on week 1 that were able to use the war chariot to conquer Egypt, to defeat the pharaohs, and actually control Egypt for like 200 years. It's difficult for the Israelite tribal contingents to face the Canaanite infantry in open ground and in set battle, and there's no way at all the Israelites could counter the chariots by any kind of conventional methods. If you look at the map, all these little dotted lines, these are all those little petty kings that sent troops from Dor and Oxba and Shimron and Kadesh, and they all met at a central location at the waters of Merom. In the campaign against the northerners, there was no escaping such an encounter, so Joshua solved the problem in a way that was to set a precedent for the subsequent Israelite commanders. As long as they were unable to pit chariot against chariot, or at least troops that were well trained in anti-chariot combat, he abided his time until he was able to surprise the Canaanites while they were camped in a narrow gorge of the Merom Brook. With no space to deploy their chariots, the vehicles were only a nuisance. And if the horses were unharnessed, either before or after watering, the chariots were actually a hindrance. And if the horses were still harnessed and got frightened, now you have horses running all over the place, dragging chariots behind them, and they can become cause a lot of harm to the troops. So with the chariots thus neutralized and temporarily out of action, Joshua and all of his troops came charging down the adjacent hill slopes, and they won a complete victory. Since Joshua had no means whatsoever of using the captured chariots, he had no choice but to destroy them and their horses. And this is a good indication of the technical backwardness of the conquering Israelite tribes compared to the Canaanites. It was not until the later days of David's reign that the Israelites reached a stage in their military development when they were able to operate chariots. And that would be in 1010 BC, almost 400 years after this encounter. So, in conclusion, hi everybody. So in conclusion, if one were to pass judgment on Joshua's generalship, you'd have to place him very high indeed among the great captains of history. His clear strategic insight is demonstrated time and time again, for example, in his choice of Jericho as his first objective, and its plain up to Gilgal, where he camped, as the initial base of the conquest for the western Palestine, or his alliance with the Gibeonites, and his swift decision to come to their assistance when they were in trouble, so as not to lose a vital foothold in the Judean mountains. Joshua also showed great strength of mind in adversity after the disastrous first attempt on capturing Ai, particularly as he had then boldly exploited that defeat and its effect on their opponents to lure the enemy into a second encounter in which the Israelite victory would be assured. His superb handling of the divided forces during the second Ai campaign and the timely and exact execution of intricate maneuvers involved also indicate a highly developed ability of leadership and military assessment. So as a great soldier, Joshua was fully aware of the limitations imposed on him by the Israelites' inferiority in armament and in training for open set battle. So he based his tactics in battles, such as that at the waters of Merom, on the Israelite qualities of speed, stealth, knowledge of the terrain, and he crushed the otherwise, quote, unbeatable enemy. And it was this approach which therefore became the model for subsequent Israelite commanders throughout history. Thus endeth the lesson. as they say. So,